I want to begin with a passage from Frederick Douglass. I do quote him a lot. No apologies. This is from a speech he made at the very last gathering, the last formal gathering of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1869. They always met in New York City for their annual meeting. And in the wake of the war, they struggled to keep it going. They had won a victory, to say the least, with emancipation. There were two schools of thought within that now old organization. It was as old as 1831. William Lloyd Garrison had always been its titular leader, and his plan was to disband it. And it was going to be disbanded. There were others, Douglass among them, who said, no, this fight is not over. We're winning. It's 1869. 13th Amendment's been passed. 14th has been ratified in 68. 15th Amendment is just going through as they hold this gathering. And a lot of them held this view. Many Northerners held this view, that once you put suffrage on some modified basis into the Constitution, the right to vote for black men, what else was to be done? A big lesson in that for history. Big lesson. Whenever you think you've won a victory, watch out. History's still waiting for you. Whenever you've been really defeated, I don't know, hang in there. But here's the way Douglass ended that speech that he gave at this 1869 American Anti-Slavery Convention. He said, our opponents seem in full retreat. Those are his words. Isn't it great? We're even about to pass suffrage, although he's only going to give modified support to the 15th Amendment because it was so limited. Then he said, quote, but slavery is not honestly dead. It did not die honestly. Had slavery's death come, this is still Douglass, from moral conviction instead of political and military necessity, had it come in obedience to the enlightenment of the American people, had it come at the call of humanity, of the slaveholder, as well as the rest of our fellow citizens, slavery might be looked upon as honestly dead. It's not honestly dead, he said. It's dead because the war killed it. Law killed it. Bloodshed killed it. But it's not dead in the hearts and minds of so many folks. It's quite a metaphor. Something can be destroyed, something, and then you begin to replace it, you begin to rebuild. But it still depends on you. Now, I want to take you through, let's visit Mr. Grant for a moment. We're going to talk about the Grant era today to a great extent. It won't totally end today. Next week, I'll bring you back to the final process of so-called Southern redemption and the retreat from Reconstruction and the traditional end of Reconstruction by 1876-77. But Grant is a huge figure, of course, in Reconstruction as well as the war. He's an amazing figure in American history. He's a man who was a lonely misfit, guy who was great on horses, grew up on a farm in Ohio. His parents were abolitionists. He was modestly anti-slavery as he became a young officer at West Point. He's going to marry into a slaveholding family. Julia Dent was his wife. She's from Missouri, pretty prominent slaveholding family. And for a very short period of time, he was technically a legal owner of some slaves. Grant, of course, was a success, as they say in the military, in the Mexican War. He learned a lot about combat in the Mexican War. But by the 1850s, he was just a lonely mid-level officer stationed at Fort Humboldt out on the northern California coast in the middle of nowhere. And when Grant got lonely and not busy, he drank. No joke. The jokes about Grant are always, yeah, if he hadn't been in his bottle, he'd have done this and that. Well, there are flaws in Charnow's recent biography of Grant, and I wrote a long essay a review essay on that in the New York Review of Books. But Ron's book is very clear-eyed about Grant's drinking problem. And he, in effect, all but drank himself out of the Army in the early 1850s. He couldn't stand it anymore. He quit. He resigned his commission. He came all the way back east with very little money in his pocket. He's already married, having children. He ended up in New York City, broke. In fact, he had whatever money he had on stolen. He had to borrow train fare from none other than James Longstreet, later one of the most famous and important Confederate generals. They'd been good friends at West Point. He borrowed money from James Longstreet to get train fare to get back out to Illinois and Missouri. At one point, Grant was selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis, wearing an old Army jacket. A broken man. And one of the things about his story that has always been so, I guess, attractive, so interesting, is that Americans love second acts, second stories. We do, don't we? It's a famous metaphor, isn't it? Third acts, fourth acts, which act are y'all on? I've quit counting mine. But when the Civil War broke out, there he was up in Galena, Illinois, that old lead mining town, and they're going to form a regiment. And looking around, hey, Grant, you were in the Army. And suddenly he's appointed colonel. And he's commander of an Illinois regiment. Within a month, he had that regiment in Tennessee. And within a few months, he's commanding a whole army. No one, frankly, well, there are other models, but few have ever risen so fast in American military command to total command as did Ulysses Grant. Fascinating personality. He's a mixture of passivity and dynamism. War inspired him, animated him. He's hardly the only man to go through that, or woman. Although with what's happening with potential appointments, women may no longer be serving the U.S. military. That's just an aside. He had a terrible problem of depression, and hence the booze. He could at times seem guileless in terms of personal relationships and so on. Complicated, messy relationship with his in-laws and extended family, to say the least, but deeply devoted to Julia, who in the course of the war will be actually become sort of anti-slavery, even though she's the daughter of slaveholders. In battle and in command, he had an extraordinary ability to understand landscape, geography, maneuver, and actually how to use these massive armies, which is no simple thing and not easy to understand by those of us without any military training. But all of this was a hell of a way out of a leather shop in Galena, which is where he was working, his brother's leather shop, just selling leather goods. in the winter of 1861. Grant will become, by the end of the war and into Reconstruction, and particularly at the end of Reconstruction, believe it or not, despite all the scandals in his administration and so on, the most famous American in the world. In the wake of his presidency in the summer of 1877, and for, I forget how many months now, 10 months I think it was? I wrote an essay on this once, but Grant and his wife Julia did a tour of the world. He was Elvis. I mean, he was. He didn't sing, but he was Grant. He was feted by kings and queens and monarchs of all kinds and rich people, nobles. He was given state dinners in Japan and state dinners in China and state dinners, you name the place. It almost killed him to travel. Grant liked accepting gifts. Not a good thing in politics if you screw up about that. Chernow called him a helpless casualty of his own fame. Not sure he was helpless. He knew what he was doing when he appointed some people. If you appoint your brother-in-law, you're asking for trouble. There was more than random corruption in his administration, as we'll see next week. He had the misfortune of serving during this extremely turbulent time of Reconstruction, when all around him were trying to use the Constitution inside out to remake the United States or not. And the question always was, where does Grant stand? Well, Grant was kind of making it up as he went, although he did have some core principles and beliefs. He was, without doubt, all for the Union. He'd shed more blood than anybody alive to save the Union. And he had shed more blood than anybody alive to destroy slavery, and he made no apologies for that. He called the Confederate cause the worst cause in human history. But he was extremely proud of Appomattox. He was extremely proud of how he treated and handled Lee at Appomattox, of the way they did all those paroles, of sending, and he was under Lincoln's orders there, but Grant made it his own policy to give paroles to over 20,000 Confederate soldiers. As long as they turned in their guns, their rifles, they just were told to go home. Grant didn't want massive persecutions or prosecutions. He thought, like Lincoln, right away, you had to start healing as fast as you could by whatever means you could. And that's really going to affect, at times, what he does about Reconstruction policies. I wish I could go on talking about Grant. The Grant of the uniform is the Grant the Civil War and Reconstruction generations kind of always wanted to remember. When he dies in 1885, he had the largest funeral ever held in the United States. It was in New York City. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. The pallbearers were a mix of Union and Confederate generals. Not sure they asked him about that. And maybe you've been to Grant's tomb over on the Hudson River. I don't know where that stupid joke came from, who's buried in Grant's tomb. It's Grant! I mean, Jesus. And one of the reasons he's so famous in the world at that moment is he wrote the greatest memoir of the 19th century. 2 volumes. Whoops, so sorry. Oh. Grant went into upstate New York in his dying days. I mean, he knew he had cancer. He had cancer of the throat because he smoked up to 20 cigars a day. He almost never was without a cigar stub in his mouth, Crowds wanted to see that. Grant, where's your cigar? If you didn't have it, you pull one out, light it up, cheers. You couldn't get cheers today for lighting up a cigar, I don't think, except in some bars. I still love the smell of a good cigar. It goes back to my grandfather, I think, but anyway, that was always mixed with the smell of beer that he made in his still in his basement. But anyway, Grant's memoirs are a magnificent work of literature. It's almost entirely about the war. He didn't write about his presidency, much at all. But that memoir of war is one of the greatest works of war literature ever written. And it's written in the classic kind of direct, declarative sentences that Grant had written from the front in his dispatches. He was a beautiful, clear writer. And if you open Grant's memoirs, and there are many editions of it now, it'll capture you, whether you know much about that era or not. It's heavy on military detail at times, but it's an amazing achievement, and he wrote it while dying. He couldn't any longer even speak, but he finished it. No one finished it for him. Mark Twain got involved to help him get it published, to promote it. And the reason was, at that moment, Grant was broke. This most famous man in the world who had gifts and money thrown on him. People gave him houses. He owned 6 or 7 houses. People kept giving him houses. This, by the way, was taken at his New Jersey house. And he had a Pennsylvania house, and he had a Maine house, and he had houses all over the place. Not because he was a rich man, but he made the world's worst investments in an investment firm called Grant and Ward took him for everything. Grant was flat broke when he wrote the memoirs. It sold like crazy. The largest selling book surpassed Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 19th century. Made back everything he had lost for his family. It's the greatest story of deathbed writing you could ever want to know about. All right, enough on. But Grant is going to be president by 1868, in the wake of. And I'll deal with the election of 1868 in just a second. But go back just a bit to the outline here. This election of 1868, the first time out since the war, comes in the wake of radical Reconstruction. It comes as radical Reconstruction is being put in place on the ground by the Congress. It comes right after the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, who was narrowly acquitted in the Senate, at Senate serving as the jury in the Senate trial of March and April of 1868. I wish I had time to do an entire lecture on that impeachment, which I do in my old course. Take that next year. But that impeachment was amazing if for no other reason than they had many grounds to try to impeach Andrew Johnson, but they went with the narrowest possible grounds. Where have you seen this before? They wanted to find a law that was broken. Instead of impeaching Johnson on what was called Article 10 in the Articles of Impeachment, which was on obstruction. He had obstructed nearly every element of Reconstruction with every lever of power he could wield. He had fired commanders of districts in the South. He had opposed and tried to obliterate the 14th Amendment. Now, the Constitution is not absolutely clear on what an impeachable offense is. And there's always been, as you just learned in recent times with the impeachment of Donald Trump, twice impeached Donald Trump, the same one who just got elected, that there's a narrow and a broad view of impeachment. The narrow view says it has to be a violation of a statute, of an actual law. The broad view says no. Presidents or Supreme Court justices or cabinet officials can be impeached for brutal abuses of power. And both have been used in our history. But Johnson will be acquitted largely because the Republicans got scared of their own power. It's a presidential election year. It had taken him 2 years to get this impeachment done. And impeached him on a violation of an act that, it's called the Tenure of Office Act, which was a law they passed to try to prevent the president from firing cabinet officials. It was on its face pretty clearly unconstitutional, but they sort of passed it to get Johnson to violate it so they'd have a violation of a law. I mean, come on, guys. They were afraid of the broad view of impeachment. We still are. We may see in the next 3 or 4 years. And who knows what to predict? But hey, with all the predictions going on now, we may see another rousing debate about the broad or narrow view of impeachment. Trouble is, you got to have a majority in the House to impeach anybody. But he's acquitted on a deal the Republicans cut with their own people and their own vote to make sure the vote came out one in favor of acquittal, because they did not want to be the party of impeachment in that fall's presidential election. And they want to run Grant for president. They don't want Grant marred by this. If they had been the party of emancipation in 1864 and painted thus by the Democrats and pilloried for it, they remember that. And in 68, they're going to face a more racist and white supremacist Democratic Party than they'd ever faced before. Meantime, in 1867, with significant majorities of both houses of Congress sent to Washington in part because Andrew Johnson had been such an obstinate barrier to anything Congress was trying to do, the American voters in the congressional elections of 1866 sent back to Washington a veto-proof Congress, two-thirds majorities, Republicans, both houses. Now remember, the ex-Confederate states are still out of the Union, which partly makes this possible. And partly will lend itself over the years to this idea in the Confederate lost cause ideology that all that Reconstruction stuff was illegitimate anyway, because, we weren't in the Union. Yeah, well, you lost a war, I think. At the core of what the Republicans will do is the first Reconstruction Act. Now, we've already talked about the first Civil Rights Act in spring 1866, the passage of the 14th Amendment by June 1866. It's undergoing ratification by the states. It will be ratified by 68. There's already a committee drafting a 15th Amendment for voting rights, and that's going to be quite a row. But in the first Reconstruction Act, they did this, and I need to show a quick map here. Sorry to run it ahead on you like this, but I know you can't see inside all these, but what the map simply shows is 2 dates for each of the ex-Confederate states. The first date is when they were readmitted to the Union. The second date is when they were taken back over by the Southern Democratic Party, or what the South called redeemed by the Democratic Party, Southern redemption. And you'll note by looking around the states, there's some are pretty early, like Tennessee. Some by early 70s, several in 1874, a huge year in the turn of American politics, if ever there was one. when the Republican Party was smashed and thrown out of Congress. But then finally 3 of them, not until 1876, which is why that famous disputed election of 1876 was such a problem. But here was the first Reconstruction Act, and this is the system by which the ex-Confederate states are brought back into the Union. And hence, all through the years, the reputation of radical Reconstruction is based in part on this act and in part on the fact that in all of the ex-Confederate states there will be new regimes created under this system, elected to office, practicing black suffrage, black male suffrage, and in some cases creating public school systems in places like South Carolina, and electing through the course of Reconstruction approximately 1,000 black people to office. That's a political revolution. And when we sometimes call Reconstruction the Second American Revolution, there's one great element of it. But how long would that last? How long could that last? It lasted longer in some places than others. The first Reconstruction Act of 1867 did this. First, it divided the southern states into 5 military districts. Virginia, North Carolina, I think was one. South Carolina, Georgia, Florida was another. Alabama, Mississippi, 5 districts. Each district was to be commanded by an officer not below the rank of brigadier general, and they went even higher, and a, quote, adequate military force. This is occupation, and it was an occupation. It wasn't the huge occupation it sometimes is portrayed as, hundreds of thousands of troops, no. But it was an occupation, it was a military occupation. And one of the great ifs of Reconstruction is always, what if that occupation had been broader, deeper, longer? Americans don't like military occupations. We don't like doing them, and we sure as hell don't like them done to us. Third, that commanding general a military officer, was to supervise the election of delegates to the state conventions that were to write new constitutions and form new governments. It's under military control. And fourth, this is key. This is a rewriting of a sort of the 14th Amendment and a precursor of the 15th. The first Reconstruction Act said all adult males, regardless of color, who were not disfranchised for participation in the war were eligible to vote. And the new constitutions written in these new state legislatures formed must provide some level of black male suffrage. And fifth and last, hard pill to swallow for the defeated Southern Confederate. In fact, impossible for them to swallow if they can help it. The fifth element of it was when a majority of voters ratified a constitution, when Congress, not the president, had approved it, when the state had ratified the 14th Amendment. It's forcing Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment as a means of getting back into the Union. Then, and only then, would a state be readmitted to the United States. And between 1866, one state was admitted earlier than the first Reconstruction Act and then had to be readmitted again. That's actually Tennessee. Between 1866 and 1870, the 11 former Confederate states were officially readmitted to the Union under that plan. Hence the sense of triumph, the sense of victory. Even in Douglass's speech saying, but slavery didn't die honestly, I'm warning you. Then there were 3 other Reconstruction Acts which were, I wish I had the time to go into all of them, but they were arranging the details for how elections were to be conducted. And they got pretty down into the weeds, which they needed to. And in '68, they're going to have a national election based on, let's see, well, Grant is going to get the nomination of the Republican Party. That had been a foregone conclusion. He, of course, kept saying he never wanted it. He was reluctant. He didn't want to be president. No, he wanted to stay retired. Don't believe that. Thomas Nast and the great cartoonist were already capturing by 1868 what's going on in the country. Oh, this is 1870, sorry. Whoops, oops. Violence has already broken out across the South. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It spreads to at least 7 southern states in '67 and '68. It was especially active in that full year of 1868 before the election ever occurred. But most Klan violence and other organizations like them, and they had many imitators, tended to happen as political violence. At election time, many massacres of people who were simply trying to vote. I'll speak of one in a moment, the famous Colfax Massacre in Louisiana. Thomas Nast and other artists began to try to capture some of this on that monument. And this was monument building time in the country. Monuments to the Civil War beginning to appear. This cartoonist said, yeah, well, on that, if you can ever get close enough to read that, it's got Civil War battles on it, it's got various kinds of events on it, it's got the triumphs for black suffrage, it's got the Reconstruction Acts on it, it's got this and that, it's got emancipation, it's got all the great elements of progress, and there's black man at the top, leaning on his knee, a black woman and her baby murdered at the bottom. Now, I'll come back to the question of violence next week, because it is throughout Reconstruction, on and off in different places, and the only time in American history, we can pray it will remain, it's the only time in American history, not that we haven't had a lot of other social violence, but it's the only time in our history when mob violence became a nearly normal part of regular politics, with huge casualties. Horatio Seymour, an oligarch, an extremely rich New Yorker, was the candidate of the Democratic Party. Seymour's running mate was Francis Blair of Missouri. And typical of many presidential campaigns, the vice president was the attack dog. And Blair, famous Blair family of Missouri, they had people who were anti-slavery and they had people who were viciously pro-slavery. Frank Blair he'd flirted with the Republican Party, as did his brother Montgomery and others in that Klan, but not now. The Seymour-Blair ticket ran the most viciously white supremacist campaign to that date in American history. Note their motto on this particular little poster. This is a white man's country, let the white man rule. That's pretty clear. Yeah. What an election it was. Here's Grant, the war hero, trying to be the candidate now of unity and harmony. You're going to be the candidate of harmony. You've got to put the Union back together. Who better than the man who crushed the South? He believed in black suffrage, said so, kind of kept quiet about it, but he said so. It's a divisive issue across the North. And when informed of his nomination, he's sitting in Washington, D.C., trying to maintain that he really didn't want the nomination. But when informed that he'd been nominated out in Chicago, May 29, 1868, again, like a month and a half after Andrew Johnson's been acquitted in the impeachment trial, and the country's kind of taken a breath, And Andrew Johnson, by the way, promised he would keep quiet, never run again, which was only partly true. But Grant's response was, his famous response, "I shall have no policy of my own to interfere against the will of the people." Did you hear that? What does that mean? I shall have no policy against the will of the people. And then he said, let us have peace. Let us have peace became headlines all over the country. Grant, let us have peace. Let us have peace. Who could be against that? It's like being against honor or devotion. He had committed to congressional control of Reconstruction and to the Reconstruction Acts. That was clear. But the party platform in 1868 kind of retrenched into ideas like order and stability. They don't want to any longer be that party of emancipation and radicalism, and the Reconstruction Acts, even though they are. They would now be protectors of the status quo, the new status quo, rather than innovators and experimenters. These radical, the John Binghams and Lyman Trumbull's and Thaddeus Stevenses have been innovators. I mean, these guys are experimenting with democracy and trying to recreate it. They're trying to create a racial democracy. But now the Republican Party is trying to say, no, we're not going to go any further. You can trust us. They're being pilloried, of course, by the other side as radicals. Radicals. I mean, people use that all the time now, don't they? Everywhere. And they're also being pilloried as N-word lovers, as proponents of racial equality, miscegenation on steroids. Black suffrage was necessary in the South, they will say, for the purposes of, quote, public safety, gratitude, and justice. But in the North, it was to be left to the whims of each state. Just let the states decide. Let Ohio decide if it wants to have black suffrage. You know, if there's to be a 15th Amendment, it's only going to be about the South. What? And we're going to have a general at the helm. Have a military officer at the helm. They're going to become now, they say, the party of sound money. Money based on specie. Economic growth. Prosperity. Tariffs. The Democrats go with the governor of New York, Horatio Seymour. He had openly supported the draft riots in 1863 in New York City against the draft and against the Irish and black people. He had an open record of opposing the war effort, and he's running against Grant. Frank Blair, his VP, was openly white supremacist. He announced that Democrats would declare the Reconstruction Acts, if they win, null and void, and they would return the South immediately to home rule. Just let them run their own business. It's all on the line. And the Democrats even went so far as to threaten, threaten in language at least, a second civil war if they lost. In rhetoric and reality, the stakes of 1868 were the results of the war. This election will say, who won? It was a memory-laden election. It's only been 3 years since Appomattox. And everybody's waving bloody shirts. Your people murdered my son. No, your people murdered 2 of my sons. Listen to some of that rhetoric. I can't resist, sorry, even though I will run out of time. If you've never heard the term bloody shirt, you have now. Because It meant accusing the other side of responsibility for all the bloodshed, for all the killing, for all the loss. Frank Blair said if Republicans win this time, it will mean the rule of a, quote, semi-barbarous race of blacks who are polygamous and destined to subject the white women to their unbridled lust. So we think we've got some tough rhetoric in our politics? Check it out. Let white men rule, screamed an editorial in the Louisville Courier-Journal. Native Negroes to native whites. Amalgamation of the races, on and on and on. Benjamin H. Hill, a former Confederate general and now wanting to run for Congress if he can get a pardon, portrayed the South under, quote, under these Reconstruction Acts, tyrannical, oppressive rule by a foreign power, driven by hate and determined to, quote, dishonor an unarmed people. They were victims. Democratic Party Northerners, on behalf of Southerners and Southerners for themselves, are portraying themselves as the victims of radicalism. Oh, I could go on and on and on. But the North responded in kind, over and over and over. In fact, the best bloody shirts were waved by Thaddeus Stevens. Just look up Thaddeus Stevens' bloody shirts. You know, he'd get up in Congress and say things like, I'll be damned if I let these people whose blood is on their coats standing right in front of me to pass any law for this country. And he'd look them right in the face. But Wendell Phillips, the famous abolitionist, was pretty good at this too. He said, we have just finished a war between two ideas. We sent our armies to South Carolina to carry our ideas. We sent our armies, if we had no right to carry our ideas, we had no right to send our armies. Only a Republican victory could hold together this revolution, he said in the '68 election. And he concluded, Seymour's election is Lee triumphing at Appomattox. That's pretty clear. Who won? Who lost? Northern newspapers, which were Republican newspapers, would constantly bring out the images of the empty sleeves of veterans. Between 30 and 40,000 amputees survived the war as Union veterans. They were all over the North. They were standing in railroad stations. Most of them couldn't get work, especially if they didn't have legs. And their crippled bodies, as the New York Tribune said, were trotted out in this election as images. The rhetoric was very ugly. KKK violence in the South broke out before the election and went on right through the election. There were armed auxiliaries even of the Democratic Party in '68. There were more than 200 political murders in Arkansas alone. The death toll in Georgia was lower, but intimidation at the polls was practiced widespread to simply try to stop black people, black men now, newly for the first time with the right to vote, from even getting near a poll. In Louisiana, more than 1,000 people died, imagine this, in political violence, most of them black, from April through November. These would be gatherings of Republicans, gatherings of Union League clubs. In Louisiana, in that election year, 21 parishes with a previous Republican vote in 1867 of 28,800 votes reported 500 votes. Intimidation worked, but it didn't work enough. Grant carried all of the North except 3 states: Oregon, well, if you want to count Oregon in the north, New Jersey and New York. Seymour was from New York. Seymour carried 3 border states, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky. This tells us still what a terrible place it was to be in those border states. And Seymour carried 2 of the reconstructed Confederate states, or states under Reconstruction. The Republicans kept a 2/3 majority of the House and 4/5 of the Senate. But this was a precarious victory. Grant actually was elected because of the several 100,000 black men who voted in southern states. There is no question statistically that without the black vote, happening for the first time on any concerted level in American history, Grant would have lost. And I guess Lee would have won at Appomattox. Now, what's also occurring is a turn. And if you'll, let's see here. I don't know, did I? No, I want to go back a little. This is another great Thomas Nast cartoon. Black men started getting elected to Congress. That's Blanche K. Bruce sitting at his desk in the U.S. Senate, the first black senator in American history from Mississippi. We'll talk more about them and who they are by the end of Reconstruction. This is a cartoon showing the ghost of Jefferson Davis because Blanche K. Bruce took Jefferson Davis's old Senate seat from Mississippi. So, you know, that, for a cartoonist, you just can't miss that. But the Supreme Court is beginning to show where the story of Reconstruction potentially is going. If you go back to the outline, I named 3 cases. And between these 3 cases and that depression that hit the country in 1873, the Panic of 1873, the turn in Reconstruction became faster than one had any right to believe it could be. Let me quickly run through these famous cases, and it tells us so much about the nature of the Supreme Court. Even people who are appointed by a party that stands for emancipation, and by the way, by the end of Reconstruction, every member of the U.S. Supreme Court had been appointed by Lincoln or Grant. Every member. But courts are often by nature conservative. They're there to define the law, protect the law. And sometimes they take that to extremes. On April 14, 1873, which was Easter Sunday, the Supreme Court handed down its decision 5-4 in the Slaughterhouse case, the first major ruling on any of the Civil War amendments. I'll explain that in a second. It'll be followed same year by the Broadwell v. Illinois case, which was about women's rights and set back women's rights for damn near half a century. And then a little later, the court will bring down the famous Cruikshank case, which is adjudicating the Colfax massacre of 1873. In every one of these cases, what's at stake is the nature of federalism. Does the adjudication of a crime, does the adjudication of any use of the 14th Amendment, equal protection, belong in state courts or federal courts? Remember John Bingham's line? John Bingham, remember him? He wanted to federalize the Bill of Rights. He wanted people's rights against discrimination to be adjudicated in federal courts and no longer rely on the whims of states. But these men who get appointed to the court don't know how to live with any other kind of federalism than states' rights federalism. And look at us today. How many times a day, if you follow the news, do you hear about, let's let the states do that. Let's let the states do this and this and this and that. Oh, let's get the federal government out of education. Let's get the federal government out of the environment. Let's get the federal government out of this and out of that. The federal government has been in our economy since the Civil War. Oh, sorry. In Slaughterhouse, it's a case in New Orleans where the butchers of the hogs, and the hog industry was huge in New Orleans, had a long-standing practice of slaughtering hogs wherever they wanted to. You didn't want to be in a lot of cities in America in the 19th century because the hogs wandered everywhere and they were slaughtered sometimes anywhere. I sat in a dissertation here at Yale about the hog slaughtering business in New York City in the 19th century, and for a couple of months I couldn't visit the city. I didn't want to go in those streets. Anyway. But they get sued by a new agency created out of this new spirit of Reconstruction, which said, no, we're going to actually regulate where you can slaughter your hogs. And we're going to make it so that you can only slaughter your hogs south down the Mississippi below the place where we draw our water for the city. It makes perfect sense, right? No, the butchers said, we can slaughter our hogs wherever we want. It's our right under the 14th Amendment. And what did the court do? It said, and it's a fascinating story in terms of who defended whom. It became immediately a national versus state authority issue. And the court ruled for traditional federalism, that agency created by the local government didn't have the authority to stop the individual rights of those butchers to slaughter their hogs wherever they wished. And if this is to be adjudicated, it can only be adjudicated in a state-level court, not in a federal court. The ruling was 5-4. And get this, the butchers even used the 13th Amendment as part of their defense. They were implying that they were the victims of a kind of enslavement by this government agency. Bradwell v. Illinois is a simple case with a terrible result. It was issued the day after the Slaughterhouse case. Myra Bradwell, a female attorney, had been denied the right to practice law in the state of Illinois because she was, quote, a married woman, and hence not considered a, quote, free agent as a citizen. Yeah, we laugh at that today, but this was real stuff then. And where are we now? Pointing to the 14th Amendment, Bradwell's lawyers contended that the state had unconstitutionally abridged her privileges and immunities, language right from the 14th, as a citizen, but the court, Supreme Court, rejected her case, her claim, declaring a woman's, this is just a moral decision, or you could say immoral decision. They ruled, quote, the paramount destiny of a woman is to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. And then came Cruikshank, the most pivotal of all Reconstruction-era court decisions, and I'll have to take it out with this. But Cruikshank is crucial. It emanated from the 1873 massacre in Colfax, Louisiana, in the wake of the 1872 election, which had produced two rival governments in Louisiana, one Republican, one Democratic, which were conducting vigilante war against each other. Colfax is way up on the Red River in the mid-northern part of Louisiana. It became a site. It had a courthouse, some houses, and it's on the river. And it had become a site of gathering for blacks and Republicans, a site of defense. They were supported by a local planter, a white planter who had become a scalawag, a Republican. Hundreds of blacks settled in and around this area called Colfax for protection and for jobs. And they were attacked at election time by paramilitary mobs. It wasn't the Klan per se, but it was just like the Ku Klux Klan. They used cannons. They used all kinds of weapons. Blacks gathered in the courthouse and around it for safety. They lit the courthouse on fire. Many of the people who died being burned in the fire. Others were shot in the back and in the face as they tried to flee from this courthouse. There was a frenzy of killing, a frenzy of mass murder. The numbers run from about, we don't know exactly how many died, as low as 75, as high as 150. Some of this was local violence, grudges being practiced by people against people they knew. The case was brought in Louisiana court against a man named Cruikshank, William Cruikshank, who had been one of the leading whites indicted for leading this mob, and he had led it. The court, with a new Chief Justice, Morrison Remnick Waite, W-A-I-T-E, appointed by Grant. And in 1874, after the death of the famous Salmon Chase. And by the way, that Chief Justice, Waite, was the fifth person Grant had to try to get confirmed because the first four were so bad, Congress wouldn't, the Senate wouldn't confirm them. Nope. People didn't want to be on the Supreme Court in these years. They'd rather run for office. In fact, many members of the Supreme Court tried to run for president while they were on the court. This decision will be 9-0, saying that these murders, even though the evidence was overwhelming, who led these mobs, how it was done, by whom it was done, this could only be adjudicated in a state court, not under federal jurisdiction. They ruled that the duty of, quote, protecting citizens' equal rights rest alone with the states, unquote. It was all but a beginning slow death knell to the 14th Amendment. It ruled that due process and equal protection, that famous clause in the beautiful 14th Amendment, could only be assessed by state action. And it meant that mass murder went unpunished. This turn toward conservatism by the court is one of the reasons for this turn away from Reconstruction. Now, I'll return next Tuesday to this question of what happened to Reconstruction, but let me leave you with this. I'll come back to Douglass, if you don't mind. Douglass gave a speech to a black audience in 1875. This is the year before the Cruikshank case. This is the year after the takeover of Congress by the Democratic Party. Klan violence and its imitators happened in many places all over the South. And Douglass went to this huge festival in what was called Uniontown in Washington, D.C. He lived right near there. And he's got a mostly black audience. But in this speech, he said this. He anticipated the impending centennial of the United States, which is about to happen the next year, 1876. He says, oh my God, we're about to have the centennial of the United States. And he said he feared that, quote, the country would lift to the sky its million voices in one grand centennial hosanna and peace and goodwill to all the white race, from gulf to lakes and from sea to sea. And as a black citizen, he declared that he dreaded, quote, this great white race will renew its vows of patriotism and flow back into its accustomed channels. He was proud, but worried. And he looked back upon 15 years of unparalleled change, of revolution, and he said, if war among the whites brought peace and liberty to blacks, what will peace among the whites bring? Metaphors are sometimes very useful. They give us somewhere to hang our hat. That one doesn't explain everything, but as Reconstruction is beginning to wane, in American terms, it is a kind of peace among the whites. Somber note. Thank you.